So let's do a little bit of review of the gross anatomy of the heart. So the heart is made up of four major chambers. We have a right atrium and a left atrium, and we'll have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. The ventricles are going to be found a little bit inferiorly towards the apex of the heart, and the two atria are going to be found towards the base of the heart where the major vessels can be found. Now, in terms of the major vessels, we have a few vessels that are going to lead us to different places. We have two circulations, a pulmonary circulation and a systemic circulation. The aorta is going to be the largest artery in the body, and that's going to take blood into the systemic circulation to perfuse all of our body tissues. We'll find the pulmonary trunk, and we'll find the superior and inferior vena cava, both of which are going to carry deoxygenated blood, which is indicated by the bluish color that they are depicted in on this slide. Oftentimes with the cardiovascular system, if you see something that's blue, it's referring to some type of vessel that holds deoxygenated blood. And if you see something red, that's often going to refer to a vessel that's going to carry oxygenated blood. So the vena cava we'll start with first. I like to think of the vena cava as the first place where blood is going to start entering back into the heart. So we'll have a superior vena cava, which is going to drain all of the deoxygenated blood from the top half of the body. And then we'll find our inferior vena cava, which will drain the deoxygenated blood from the bottom half of the body. Both of these large vessels take this blood back to the right atrium, and they're taking this deoxygenated blood. So after blood has gone out, it's offloaded its oxygen out to the tissues and picked up carbon dioxide, we have this deoxygenated blood that enters back into the right atrium through the SVC and the IVC. Now the right atrium is going to eventually connect with the right ventricle, and that's going to be shown down here. Very, very muscular walls can be found on the ventricles. And then the right ventricle is then going to pump into the pulmonary circulation. So that's going to go through what's known as the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk will bifurcate into our left pulmonary artery as well as our right pulmonary artery. So this pulmonary trunk is going to split into two different pulmonary arteries, and those pulmonary arteries take that deoxygenated blood out to the lungs, specifically through the capillaries that pass right next to the alveoli in the lungs, and that's going to allow for reoxygenation from the oxygen that we breathe in from the air. And that oxygen is going to diffuse into the bloodstream, and it's eventually going to come back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. And we have four of these. We have the two left pulmonary veins, and we'll have two right pulmonary veins. And so both of those are going to dump blood back into the left atrium, which connects directly to the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is going to be the largest, most muscular chamber of the entire heart. The left ventricle is going to eventually pump back out of the aorta, and then the aorta continues the circuit. So we have this continuous pathway that is flowing through the heart. Blood is going to take this continuous pathway as it travels through the body, gets reoxygenated and deoxygenated depending on where it's at. And the structures that are highlighted on this slide are the major ones that I pointed out in the last video as well. Now, if we're going to get really specific, the aorta does have a couple parts. The aorta connects to the left ventricle, and it receives blood from the left ventricle, and it's always going to arch over and eventually come down. It's going to eventually start to run inferiorly, and we have different names for the different parts based on the direction that blood's flowing in it. So we have the ascending aorta, we have the arch of the aorta, and we'll also find the descending aorta based on the structure of the aorta and which way blood is flowing at different parts. So again, this is the anterior side of the heart. We can move to this picture, and we can also see most of those structures here on the posterior side as well. The right atrium and the left atrium are a little bit more nicely viewed from the posterior side. You can see that's the posterior side we're looking at. You can see the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And again, you can imagine we've rotated this heart 180 degrees. So the chambers change sides based on the way that we're looking at the picture. We'll also see our aorta up here. We'll see our superior vena cava as well as our inferior vena cava, our right and left pulmonary veins, as well as our right and left pulmonary arteries. And you can actually see those a lot better from the posterior view. You can see these are the pulmonary arteries, and these are going to be the pulmonary veins. These will dump into the left atrium, which will eventually allow blood to flow into the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle is going to pump that blood up into the aorta. And then the aorta is going to take that blood out to the rest of the body. Now, I have just very quickly gone over the pathway that blood takes as it goes through the cardiovascular system. We will start to elaborate on the rest of the structures that are shown on this slide. But we want to get a nice idea of the anatomy of the heart before we start to understand how blood is going to get pumped through the heart. And we have to understand which chambers are found where and which vessels lead to what, because that's going to give us a lot of indication about what processes are happening in different parts of the heart. This will be the first picture you'll see here of the dissected heart. So you can actually see we've taken a section and we're now showing you the inside of the chambers. So it's a lot easier from this slide to see how the right atrium will eventually allow blood to enter into the right ventricle. You can see there's this little valve here. It's going to open up and allow blood to enter into the right ventricle. And the same thing's true over here with the left atrium and the left ventricle. You can see there's a little valve in between. There will also be valves in between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, as well as the left ventricle and the aorta. So those valves are going to regulate the flow between either the atria and the ventricles, or perhaps the ventricles and the large vessels that are going to take blood out to our different circulations. So I'm going to slow down a little bit, and we're going to go over the pathway that blood takes through the heart again. But I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis on some different structures this time around. I want you to have an idea of the anatomy of the heart, but now let's take a step back and really start to digest what we see here. So again, there is a pulmonary circulation and a systemic circulation. It's very, very important that we understand that there are two different places that blood is going to go. The pulmonary circulation is not nearly as widespread as the systemic circulation, as it only goes to the lungs so that it can reoxygenate blood. Now, the systemic circuit, on the other hand, is going to contain all of the rest of the vessels in our bodies. We'll even have some systemic arteries that actually go to the lungs to supply the tissues. Those are not going to directly help for reoxygenation per se, but they are going to supply the tissues of the lungs. So again, I will get started here with the superior vena cava as well as the inferior vena cava and how that blood enters back into the right atrium. So that's going to be where we really like to start. That's where I appreciate starting because it's really one of the first chambers that blood is going to eventually enter back into the heart with. So you can see that the theme on this slide is that the right atrium is going to receive blood from both the superior and inferior vena cava. And so both of these large vessels are going to take this blood, dump it into this chamber, and this chamber, as the blood continually gets pumped through the heart, will constantly get filled up. And as it gets filled, it's eventually going to contract. The muscles and the walls of the atrium are going to contract, and that's going to squeeze the blood through this little valve into the right ventricle. Now, there is one other structure that takes blood back into the right atrium, and it is called the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is not a structure we have gone over yet. However, as we continually go over the heart, I will continue to mention the coronary sinus. This is going to be part of what's known as the coronary circulation. So the heart's main purpose, as we know, is to pump blood through the body, which will allow for tissue perfusion. But we also have to keep in mind that the heart itself is a tissue, and it needs to be perfused as well. So the coronary circulation is actually a series of blood vessels that can be found on the heart, and that's actually going to allow the heart to perfuse itself. And so the coronary sinus is what's going to bring blood back to the right atrium from the coronary circulation. But we have another couple slides that will go over that circulation specifically in just a little bit. So for right now, we really want to keep focused on the superior and the inferior vena cava, bringing blood back to the right atrium. So this is going to eventually go through this little valve into the right ventricle. Blood is going to enter into the right ventricle, and this valve has a name. In fact, all of the valves on the heart have names. This one is specifically called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve specifically separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. Very, very important that you know the location, the specific location of the tricuspid valve. Now, once the blood has passed through the tricuspid valve, and that valve is also named because there are 3 cusps on it, hence the tri portion at the beginning. Once blood has entered back into the right ventricle, it's then going to get pumped by the ventricular walls out into the pulmonary trunk. But it has another valve to pass through before it can enter into the pulmonary trunk, and that is known as the pulmonary valve. Now, I like the name of the pulmonary valve. I think it's very appropriately named, as it's going to separate the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. So the one structure that begins with pulmonary connecting to the ventricle is going to give you an indication of where the pulmonary valve sits. So once blood is entered into the pulmonary trunk, we split into 2 pulmonary arteries. Make sure you are aware of that. There are only 2 pulmonary arteries, one left pulmonary artery and one right pulmonary artery. That's going to be different when we get to the veins, as you can see that there are actually 2 right pulmonary veins and 2 left pulmonary veins. That tells us that we're looking at 4 pulmonary veins, 2 on each side. But eventually, after we've gotten back from that pulmonary circulation, it is the pulmonary circulation that connects the pulmonary arteries with the pulmonary veins. Once we've gotten back from the pulmonary circulation, we're going to end up dumping that blood into the left atrium. Now, one thing you might start to notice is there are different colors on the heart, the red and the blue colors, and we've gone from the right side to the left side. And on top of that, we can see that there is a color change from blue to red. So it is the pulmonary circulation that takes that deoxygenated blood that our body tissues have already used, and it's going to eventually reoxygenate that and bring this reoxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart, because this is the blood that's about to get pumped out into the rest of your body. So that's why these are actually shown in red, and over here we show these in blue. So once blood has made its way back into the left atrium, we know that that blood is going to enter into the left ventricle afterwards. Now, there is, of course, going to be another valve that separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. And this valve is very similar to this valve. We call both of these atrioventricular valves because they separate both atria from ventricles. And this valve only has 2 cusps, unlike the tricuspid valve, which had 3. So therefore, we call this the bicuspid valve. And another very common name for this is the mitral valve, and I'd like you to know both of those terms for this valve, the bicuspid or the mitral valve. So that's going to separate the left atrium from the left ventricle. Now we're going to come to see that the left ventricle is going to get connected to the aorta, and there will also be a valve separating that, which is known as the aortic valve. So the aortic valve tells you exactly where the left ventricle is going to pump blood into, and the pulmonary valve is also going to tell you where the right ventricle is going to pump blood into. However, I can tell you from firsthand experience, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve are very easily mixed up. I cannot tell you how many times I used to mix up the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. So I have a nice little trick that you can use to remember where each one is found. Based on the way that we are looking at the heart, we'd like to start blood off right here at the right atrium. We're going to use that convention to understand these 2 different valves and which is which. So the tricuspid valve is going to be first and will eventually go back to the bicuspid valve. So the little trick that I have to remember the order of the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve and which chambers they separate is that you always want to make sure that you try something before you buy something. So that's your little trick to remember the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve in which correct order they come within. And just, once again, I'll just repeat myself. The aortic valve is going to separate the left ventricle from the aorta specifically. So the aorta is going to be found up here, our body's largest artery. So that characterizes the pathway that blood takes as it makes its way through the heart. That is a very, very important pathway. I cannot stress to you enough how important that's going to be for your upcoming second exam. So make sure you feel very, very good about this pathway. Now, some of the things that are labeled on this slide, such as these arteries and this trunk that you can see up here, these will be further discussed when we get into the blood vessels specifically. So I'm not going to do much on these in this presentation. However, there are some other growth structures of the heart that we can now see that we've taken a section and started to look in the heart. So the first thing that I need to mention is that the atria and the ventricles are very different types of chambers. Both of them do have a muscular wall, and both of them are going to pump blood. However, you can see from this slide how much thinner the walls of the atria are compared to the very thick walls of the ventricles. The ventricles are pumping into circulations that have much more resistance, and therefore we need to have a much thicker muscular wall in order to pump against the resistance of the rest of the blood in the vasculature. I like to think about it in terms of, well, the atria just need to get blood next door. The ventricles need to get blood all the way throughout the entire body. So that's why these walls are going to be much more muscular than the walls of the atria. So the insides of the atria tend to look rather normal. However, inside of the ventricles, we're going to see some other structures in here. The first thing that I want to mention about the inner walls of the ventricles is that there are these muscles that course along the inside of these chambers. You can really see them nicely depicted here in the right ventricle, but I want you to also understand that the left ventricle has these as well. These irregular growths of muscles on the walls on the inside of the ventricles are what are referred to as trabeculae carneae. And trabeculae carneae is only going to be found on the walls of the ventricles. That will not be found inside of the walls of the atria. Now there's also going to be some prominent muscular projections inside of the ventricles as well. And these are what are referred to as papillary muscles. You can see a papillary muscle is shown here, and we'll also have a papillary muscle found here. In the right ventricle, we'll see papillary muscles here. The papillary muscles are also going to help for the closing of the valves as blood gets transported from one chamber to the next. And they do this through one other structure that's found inside of the ventricles that's known as chordae tendineae. I believe that the proper pronunciation of this is actually chordae tendineae, but I learned it as chordae tendineae, and that's what I'm going to call it. So the papillary muscles are truly cone-shaped projections of the trabeculae carneae in the ventricles, and those are going to be connected to these cord-like tendons known as the chordae tendineae. Now each of the chordae tendineae is going to attach to one of the valve leaflets. And for those of you that are unaware, a leaflet is really just like a flap. Now the bicuspid valve is going to have 2 flaps, and the tricuspid valve is going to have 3, hence their name. I'm going to refer to those as valve leaflets. So the chordae tendineae attach to each of those valve leaflets, and they actually help in the process of preventing the valve leaflets from inverting, and therefore they prevent backflow of blood through the valves. When there is a problem with one of these, and there is backflow of blood into one of the previous chambers in the direction that blood is not supposed to go, that is called a heart murmur. Now the other structure that we have here on the heart that I really want to point out on this slide is shown right here. This is called the interventricular septum. Inter means between, and so this is the septum that is between the 2 ventricles. And this is also very muscular as it makes up part of the left and the right ventricular walls. So if you're still struggling with the pathway that blood takes to get through the heart, you'll actually see this yellow highlighted portion that's going to show you the direction of the blood flow. So we started with the superior and inferior vena cava, and that allows blood to flow into the right atrium. The right atrium will then allow blood flow through the tricuspid valve to enter into the right ventricle, and that's going to allow blood to go into the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary valve. And we now know that the pulmonary trunk separates into 2 pulmonary arteries, one right and one left. Now once these pulmonary arteries make their way through the pulmonary circulation, they're eventually going to dump back into the left atrium through the 4 pulmonary veins, 2 left and 2 right. And once blood has made its way into the left atrium, the next location it will go is to the left ventricle, which will eventually pump blood out into the aorta and out to the systemic circulation. A simpler way we could say this is that it's going to send blood all over the body, a much simpler way than the systemic circulation. But I do want you to understand which circulation does what. Now I've posed this question here, asking why the wall of the left ventricle is much thicker than that of the right ventricle. And I've already sort of given the spoiler on that in terms of the atria versus the ventricles. So we know that the ventricles are going to pump through these much larger, vaster circulations that contain all of these different blood vessels and many different arrangements. So there's lots of resistance, naturally, of all of the tubes that make up our vasculature. The atria, on the other hand, just need to go from one chamber to the next. And so that's why their walls are much less thick than that of the ventricles. But if you do notice, the left ventricular wall is much thicker than that of the right ventricle. And the reason that is because the left ventricle is strictly pumping through the systemic circulation, which branches much more than that of the pulmonary circulation, which the right ventricle is going to pump into. So here's a nice specimen to sort of show us this. You can see the walls of the right ventricle and how much thinner it is than that of the left ventricle. So we're now going to direct our focus to the valves of the heart. Now I've already shown you that there are 4 valves. There's a tricuspid and a bicuspid, and there's an aortic and a pulmonary valve. So there's 4 valves that we have. And each valve is going to separate an atria from a ventricle or a ventricle from a large blood vessel. So we can classify these heart valves in 2 ways. We have atrioventricular valves, also known as AV valves, and we have our semilunar valves, or our SL valves. So the atrioventricular valves, as the name suggests, are going to be the valves that separate the atria from the ventricles, and the semilunar valves are going to be the valves that separate the ventricles from a large vessel. Now, we have the tricuspid and the bicuspid, which are our atrioventricular valves. Remember, you want to try before you buy, and that will tell you which valve is going to separate which set of atria and which set of ventricles. And that's going to tell you which set of atria and ventricles. So the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are our AV valves. And we'll also find the pulmonary valve as well as the aortic valve. And those are going to be our semilunar valves. Those are going to be found much closer up towards the larger vessels. Now the whole purpose of the valves in the heart is to prevent backflow of blood in the opposite direction. We just spent a good chunk of time discussing the pathway that blood takes as it goes through the heart. And it's very important that blood does continue going in that pathway, specifically in the direction that we discussed, as that is going to be the direction that allows for the reoxygenation of tissues. So if blood is going backwards, that's going to be taking bad blood back to the tissues, and we definitely don't want that to happen. So the whole purpose of the valves is to make sure that we don't have backflow and that we can keep our blood moving in the right direction. So I've discussed these little valve leaflets. These are the little flaps that are making up the valve, and those are going to open and close based on the pressure changes that are occurring in the heart due to the contraction of both the atria and the ventricles. And this is where we see the papillary muscles as well as the chordae tendineae coming into play. So you can see we've sort of zoomed in here on the bicuspid valve, which is also known as the mitral valve, as I mentioned a few slides ago. So this is the valve that we are looking at. This is our bicuspid valve. So all of our valves are going to switch between open positions and closed positions. And when they are open, blood's going to be allowed to flow through the valve into the next chamber, and when they're closed, blood flow is going to be prevented. What we're going to see about the AV and the SL valves is that while one set of the AV valves is open, the semilunar valves are going to be closed, and vice versa. So both of the AV valves will open together, and at the same time, both of the SL valves will close at the same time the AV valves open. So the AV valves are going to open together, and at the exact same time that the AV valves open, the SL valves are going to close. And when the SL valves then open, the AV valves are going to close. So what's truly causing these valves to open and close are the different changes in pressure. We have to remember that the walls of the heart are made up of cardiac muscle, and muscle's purpose is to contract. So if we can imagine here, when the atria contract, that's going to increase pressure inside of this chamber, and that's going to want to force blood through this valve into the left ventricle. It was the increase in pressure of the atria that opened up this valve. But eventually, that blood that's now entered into our ventricle is going to get pumped into the aorta, and new blood is going to be coming in to the left atrium. So when blood is passing from the left atrium to the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve must be open. However, eventually when it is the left ventricle's turn to push blood into the aorta, the left ventricle is going to contract, and that's going to force the valves closed. And that is due from the increase in pressure that occurred in the left ventricle. As that ventricle squeezes upon itself and squeezes upon the blood that's inside of the chamber, that's going to push those valve flaps closed. And this little arrow depiction is showing you that blood would be allowed to hit that valve and not pass back into the left atrium. Now, all four of our valves are going to work in the exact same way. So you can see here in the open position, the chordae tendineae are much more loose, and the papillary muscles are going to be much more relaxed. While in the closed position, you can see the papillary muscles are a bit more firm and larger, as they're going to be contracted, and the chordae tendineae are going to be much tighter, as they're preventing that valve from opening. So truly, the purpose of the chordae tendineae is to prevent the inversion of these two valve leaflets. If we didn't have the chordae tendineae, the increased pressure in the ventricles would actually force this valve open backwards, and that would allow for backflow. So that's why we have to have the chordae tendineae to prevent that. So specifically, the AV valves are going to prevent backflow from the ventricles to the atria, and the semilunar valves are going to prevent backflow from the arteries into the ventricles. And by arteries, we're referring to the pulmonary trunk as well as our aorta. Now, as I just mentioned, we have these valves that are going to be working together based on the way the heart is pumping. So both of the semilunar valves are going to close at the exact same time. And at that same time that those semilunar valves close, the AV valves are going to open. So just for reference, we are looking at a superior view of the heart. We're looking from the top and seeing these different valves shown here. So both of the SL valves are closed at the exact same time, and while those two are closed, the AV valves are going to be open. But vice versa, whenever the SL valves open, the AV valves are going to close. And again, this is due to the different pressure changes that are occurring due to the contraction of the walls of the myocardium. Thanks to the chordae tendineae, when the ventricles contract, that's going to force the AV valves closed, but these SL valves are going to be allowed to open. And that's how we allow for a consistent blood flow through the cardiovascular system. Now, unfortunately, as always, there can be some things that go wrong. So this slide focuses on valvular disorders that we're going to often see with the heart. The first of which is the mitral valve prolapse, or the MVP. Now, all of our valves can prolapse. However, this is the most common one that we see. A prolapse just refers to the inversion of one of the valve leaflets. The mitral valve prolapse is going to be focused here at the bicuspid valve. That separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. So if one of these valve leaflets were to invert, perhaps because the chordae tendineae were loosened or this valve was a little bit longer, that would allow for backflow of blood back into the left atrium. Now, as I said, this can occur with all of the different valves. However, the MVP is the most common. This can affect up to 30% of the population, and it's not always a life-threatening condition. Heart murmurs refer to abnormal sounds that come from the heart, such as a clicking sound or perhaps gurgling noises that are heard during some point in the cardiac cycle. These are most commonly found in children, and they do not always pose a threat. In fact, some adults can have heart murmurs, and those can be innocent also. Incompetent heart valves can cause heart murmurs when the valve should be closed, but it's not, and that therefore is allowing backflow into one of the previous chambers. Page 719 in your textbook will actually show you the specific places that physicians will put the stethoscope in order to listen for heart murmurs in each of the chambers. Valvular stenosis refers to the stiffening of heart valves. This can in turn narrow the size of the openings of the valve, and that will prevent blood flow through that valve. So these are just the first of a few pathologies that we see related to the heart. These specifically focus on the heart valves, but we'll start to go into some other pathologies as we get further on in this presentation. Now, specifically with the heart, we have three circulations that we're going to look at. Two of them are the ones I've mentioned the most, the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. But there's also a coronary circulation, which we will discuss in just a while. First off, however, we're going to spend a bit of time discussing the systemic and the pulmonary circulations as they work so closely together and connect with each other. So you can see this picture has numbered each of the chambers and the pathway that blood is going to take. We've now spoken quite a bit about this pathway. So I expect by now that you're at least starting to get your bearings with each of these different chambers and what they're going to lead into. But we also need to talk more about where the pulmonary arteries are going to go and where the aorta is going to go. And that is going to be the systemic and the pulmonary circulations. So again, we'll go ahead and start here from the right atrium. The SVC and the IVC are both going to bring deoxygenated blood back to the heart. That is blood that has already let its oxygen go into the tissues, and we need to bring it back to be reoxygenated. We know that that blood is going to go through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle, and you can also see that that's shown here on this diagram as well. The right ventricle will pump through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk will bifurcate into our two pulmonary arteries. All of this is still on the right side of the heart. Now, the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are pumping into two different circulations. The right side is going to pump into the pulmonary circulation, and the left side is going to pump into the systemic circulation. And since the right side is pumping into the pulmonary circulation, where we will reoxygenate blood, the right side of the heart always contains deoxygenated blood. So this is a nice little diagram to help keep all of these different parts of the heart in order for you. Now eventually the pulmonary arteries are going to pump into this pulmonary circulation. Now the pulmonary circulation is a series of very, very small branched vessels that eventually turn into the smallest vessels in the body known as capillaries. Capillaries are one cell layer thick, and they are so thin that they allow for oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusion in and out of the capillary walls. So you can see that in this pulmonary circulation, we're actually going to take carbon dioxide as a waste product from our tissues and allow it to leave through the lungs. And we're going to take oxygen in that we are breathing in. So every time we inhale, we pull air into our lungs, and air, being a mixture of a bunch of different gases, is going to contain some oxygen. Well, specifically, the oxygen that's in the air diffuses into the pulmonary capillaries and gets picked up by those deoxygenated red blood cells. Once these red blood cells pick up oxygen, they're going to be considered reoxygenated, and we have the switch from the blue color to the red color. So once the pulmonary capillaries have reoxygenated that blood, that's going to eventually come back through the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins are here, and those contain oxygenated blood. Those flow into the left atrium, and the left atrium connects to the left ventricle through that bicuspid valve. Now the left ventricle, being much thicker so that it can pump into the circulation that requires more resistance, this left ventricle is going to pump through the aortic valve and into the aorta. Now the aorta, being the largest artery in the body, is going to be the origin for all of the other arteries that branch from it. You can see here's just a few that branch from the aorta, but as the aorta progresses down, we'll have many other vessels that are going to branch off of the aorta. Those eventually are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until we form systemic capillaries. So these are very similar to the pulmonary capillaries, but we have different processes going on over here. So all of our body tissues need to have oxygen in order to make ATP. Think about when you do an activity such as exercising, your body needs a lot of oxygen in order to make the ATP necessary to facilitate the exercise. So the way that oxygen gets to those body tissues is here in the systemic circulation. That blood is going to get pumped through these capillary beds and eventually allow for the offloading of oxygen to the body tissues. And those cells that are working hard and making ATP are producing carbon dioxide from a few of our metabolic reactions. That carbon dioxide is eventually going to diffuse into the blood, and that is considered a waste product. We need to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So that's going to get taken back up in the veins back to the heart so that we can reoxygenate blood and release more CO2 from the lungs. And then, once blood has made its way back to the heart, we're going to continue this process as blood makes its way through the cardiovascular system. So that is an overview of the systemic and the pulmonary circulations. But there's also that third circulation I mentioned, which is the coronary circulation. So the coronary circulation is a series of vessels that are found on the heart itself. The heart actually pumps blood into this coronary circulation and keeps itself perfused with oxygen so that it can continue to pump blood throughout the body. Just as all arteries will take blood away from the heart and all veins will take blood back to the heart, the coronary arteries and the coronary veins are no different. Now, there was one discrepancy with the systemic and the pulmonary arteries, and that's that the systemic arteries are oxygenated blood and the pulmonary arteries are deoxygenated blood. The pulmonary circulation is a bit unique in that manner. However, the coronary circulation is going to reflect our systemic circulation in that the coronary arteries are taking oxygenated blood out to the actual walls of the heart, and the coronary veins are going to take the waste products and the carbon dioxide from the myocardium, and they're going to bring those back to the coronary sinus, which will eventually bring that blood back into the right atrium. So I have all of the coronary arteries shown on this slide, and we'll find all of the coronary veins on this slide. So we're going to go over the ones that I need you to know. So we start from the aorta. In fact, the coronary circulation branches from the aorta in two major vessels. We have the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. And you can see that both of these are listed here. The left coronary artery and the right coronary artery can both be found coming from the aorta. So both of these are going to give rise to what we know as the coronary circulation. So you can see that towards the left side over here, where we have our left ventricle and our left atrium, the left coronary artery is going to branch out. It's going to come over in this manner, and it's going to split, also known as bifurcate. A bifurcation is when a vessel splits into two different vessels. So when one vessel splits into two. So the left coronary artery is going to branch into the circumflex artery as well as the anterior interventricular artery. And both of those are listed up here as well. So we have the left coronary, it's going to go to the left side, and that's eventually going to provide blood supply to the myocardium of the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now the circumflex artery specifically is going to branch off to the side, and it's going to curve around the back of the heart, which is where this vessel gets its name. But we're also going to have this second branch, which is the anterior interventricular artery. Now, I know that's a big word, that's a lot of syllables to say in one statement, but there's a lot that we can tell from the name of this artery. First off, the fact that we call it an anterior artery shows that it's on the front side of the heart. And interventricular means that it's between the two ventricles. So this is just the artery that's between the two ventricles on the front side of the heart. Now this is eventually going to go down and supply the interventricular septum, and it's also going to help supply the walls of the right and the left ventricles. You can see that there are many other branches that do come off of this artery specifically. We just need to know the major ones that are listed. Now that's really what you need to know about the left coronary artery. Next, we're going to discuss the right coronary artery. Now the right coronary artery is going to come out of the heart, and it's going to eventually course along the side of the heart. Now you can see right here, we have this branch that's going to come around what I prefer to call the margin of the heart, right on the edge of the heart. Hence why we call this the marginal branch, because it's right on the edge. Now the right coronary artery is actually going to continue at this point, and when it gets towards the back side of the heart, it's going to branch another artery down the posterior wall of the heart, and that is going to be called the posterior interventricular artery. This is just like the anterior interventricular artery, but this one is on the back side. So we have our marginal artery and our posterior interventricular artery, which are the two major branches that come off of the right coronary artery. So what you need to understand is that the aorta comes out of the heart. The left ventricle is pumping blood through that aortic valve into the aorta. And blood is going to enter into the systemic circulation from the aorta. But these tiny little vessels that are branching from the base of the aorta are going to facilitate the actual perfusion of the myocardium itself. Our left coronary is going to have two major branches, and our right coronary is going to have two major branches. The left coronary artery gives us the circumflex and the anterior interventricular artery, and the right coronary is going to give us our marginal artery as well as our posterior interventricular artery. And with these different vessels that are supplying the heart, you can see that we've really covered most of the tissue of the heart just from these. Now, once that blood makes its way into the myocardium, brings the oxygen to the cardiac muscle, and supplies the cardiac muscle is going to be releasing waste products and taking the oxygen into the cardiac muscle cells. And that leaves us with deoxygenated blood. And deoxygenated blood needs to make its way back to the right atrium. And that is going to be done with the coronary veins. Now, I personally always thought of blood vessels as going from large vessels into small vessels, but we have to flip that convention on its head when we're talking about the veins. Blood in veins actually travels from small vessels into larger vessels, because they're going to be on the other side of those capillary beds that are found in the tissues. So we sort of want to look at these in reverse compared to how we looked at the coronary arteries. So we'll find a great cardiac vein, a middle cardiac vein, and a small cardiac vein. And I'm sure you can deduce a bit about each of these based on the way that they are named. The great cardiac vein is going to be found here coursing up the interventricular sulcus, right next to the anterior interventricular artery. These are going to be found in the same places. And what that tells us is the great cardiac vein is going to pull that deoxygenated blood from the exact same tissues that the anterior interventricular artery had just supplied. So the great cardiac vein is going to eventually come up, it's going to curve back, and dump into this large sac on the back of the heart known as the coronary sinus. And this was that other structure that's going to dump into the right atrium. Now we'll also find a middle cardiac vein that's found on the posterior side of the heart, but it courses right up the middle of the posterior side, hence the name, the middle cardiac vein. And then we'll also find the small cardiac vein, which is going to eventually branch over this way in the opposite direction as the great cardiac vein did. And all three of these are dumping into this coronary sinus, which is that sac-like structure on the backside of the heart. So the coronary sinus is going to be our other major connection point for blood to get back into the right atrium. So now we need to understand that we have a superior vena cava and an inferior vena cava that's taken that deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium, but we'll also have the coronary sinus, which will consolidate all of the deoxygenated blood from the myocardium itself, and that's going to funnel right back into the right atrium so that we can go and push that through the pulmonary circulation, where we will then reoxygenate that blood. Now, a couple more homeostatic imbalances or pathologies that we're going to discuss is angina pectoris and an infarct. You also might call this a myocardial infarction. So the literal meaning of angina pectoris means strangled chest. So this is going to refer to some very severe chest pains. This often feels like a tightness or a squeezing sensation in the chest. If one of the coronary arteries gets blocked by some type of embolus, that can lead to a deprivation of oxygen going to a particular part of the cardiac muscle. If there is a blockage in one of the coronary arteries due to some type of piece that broke off of a thrombus or something of the sort, perhaps atherosclerosis or other solid buildups in the cardiovascular system, that can prevent blood flow to the cardiac muscle. The heart is in need of a steady supply of oxygen, so if we are depriving the myocardium of oxygen, that can lead to this angina. Now, a myocardial infarction is another way of saying a heart attack. Now, this is often going to be associated with the angina, as this is going to be felt in terms of pain in the chest. But this goes one step further than angina. A myocardial infarction more specifically refers to the actual death of the cardiac myocytes, and that is caused by some type of oxygen deprivation. Just as we saw an embolus causing a stroke in the brain, the myocardial infarction is the same thing that's occurring with the cardiac muscle cells. And you can actually see that there is an infarct here at this place in the wall of this ventricle here. Because the heart tissue that is specifically deprived of oxygen is going to be replaced by scar tissue, we don't actually replace the infarct with new cardiac myocytes. The heart and cardiac muscle do not replenish themselves very well. And because of this, the heart is going to lose quite a bit of its strength due to a myocardial infarction. Depending on the area and the size of the infarcted tissue, this could also potentially affect the cardiac conduction system, which would in turn disturb the rhythm and the pumping of the heart as well. So we're going to switch gears a little bit now and discuss the histology of cardiac muscle. As we already know, cardiac muscle is considered one of our 3 types of muscles. But cardiac muscle is unique from both skeletal and smooth muscles. Now it will be striated, which is a lot like the skeletal muscles that we had seen. We are going to use the same myofibrils that we saw in skeletal muscle. However, if we remember, skeletal muscle cells were very long and cylindrical in shape. Cardiac muscles assume what's called a branched shape, and I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide. We're going to be limited to pretty much 1 nucleus per cell. You may find a second one in there, but oftentimes under the microscope we just see the one. And we'll also have lots and lots of mitochondria, as most muscle tissues do. The big difference, though, with cardiac muscle that we didn't have in any of our other types of muscles were the intercalated discs. The intercalated discs are very, very specialized and only found in cardiac muscles. What makes the intercalated discs so special is that we have gap junctions and desmosomes, 2 unique types of cell junctions, and we'll find both of them within the intercalated discs. So you can see that this is this branched arrangement. This is not long and cylindrical like we saw our skeletal muscle cells to be. This is a branched arrangement where we have different muscle fiber portions that are all in zigzag shapes, and this allows for our cardiac muscle tissue to form a network of cells. And the purpose of having a network of cells compared to a bunch of parallel, very long muscle fibers is that when we have this branched arrangement of cells, we can contract our muscle around the contents of the vascular system's chambers. So that is the necessity of this branched arrangement. Now we're not going to see as many nuclei as we saw with skeletal muscle cells either. We're just going to have pretty much 1, maybe 2 nuclei per muscle cell. But the real thing you want to look for with cardiac muscles are the intercalated discs. And these are very easily viewable under the microscope. It's very, very easy to find these. And therefore, cardiac muscle is quite a distinct type of tissue. So as a bit of review, in these intercalated discs we have gap junctions and desmosomes, which are 2 types of junctions that you likely have not heard of since A&P1. So I'm going to real quickly tell you some of the characteristics of each. Desmosomes use plaques to form very, very strong bonds between 2 cell membranes. Desmosomes are necessary within these intercalated discs because the cardiac muscle is contracting pretty much once every second for our entire lives. So we have to have a very strong junction in order to accommodate for the metabolic needs of the heart. Now we'll also have gap junctions that can be found in the heart. Gap junctions are formed with little proteins known as connexons, and connexons form little pores between the cell membranes of 2 adjacent cells. They're also going to be loose enough to allow certain things to pass in between those cells. But what you really want to focus on are these little pores that can be found connecting the cytoplasm of 2 cardiac myocytes. These little pores, the connection between the cytoplasm of 2 cells, allows for a much faster and easier diffusion of molecules between one cell and another. So the purpose of a gap junction is to allow for very rapid cell-to-cell communication. We can propagate signals much, much faster if we have these gap junctions. And the cardiac muscle is just the place that we're going to need to have these, as we want to have all of the muscle fibers within a single chamber contracting at exactly the same time. So we find both the gap junction and the desmosome within the intercalated disc, and we will only find the intercalated disc specifically on our cardiac muscle.